Pity you can't see. My name is Phindile Kunene, and I'm going to be facilitating this session this afternoon, early evening. And the framing question for this session is: how inclusive are our political parties? How democratic are our political parties? And we're asking this question with decision-making in mind, policy-making in mind, how we handle internal dissent in mind, as well as questions around elections and accountability. But the assumption being made overall is that the internal democracy within parties, so what happens inside parties, is important for our political system and is important for democracy. So in a sense, that's the framing question, and that's the framing assumption for this particular webinar. We have, as part of the panel and people who are going to kick us off, we've got the ANC and a representative from the ANC, Comrade Beatie Hofmeyr, who's an elections expert, who's been an activist for many, many years, and who's going to share some of the insights and what also she's learned and is learning on her journey, and what she thinks about this question of internal party democracy or intra-party democracy, which in itself is a contested concept. And then we've got Joel, and Joel is going to help us to understand what My Vote Counts is finding as this topic is being researched, and what this topic has got to do with South Africa. After all, in South African or political parties in South Africa. Why the ANC? I suppose the ANC is the biggest political party. The ANC is the oldest political party, but also the ANC is fresh out of the 6th policy conference, where the buzzword renewal was heard over and over again. So it's important to talk to the ANC about that, but also theoretically, Comrade Beatie, the ANC has often made the comment that it is not a private entity, but it's a collective property of the oppressed and the toiling masses. So that's what we're also going to be testing, I suppose, in this discussion, using this concept of intra-party democracy. I must make the announcement that My Vote Counts is launching the paper or research paper on intra-party democracy, IPD, and you can find that paper live on the website as we speak. Some very interesting insights, I'm sure. But without wasting more time, I'd like to hand it over to Comrade Beatie to take us through what the ANC's reading of this concept of intra-party democracy, to speak about some of the challenges of facing the ANC at the moment insofar as internal democracy is concerned, but to also talk about some of the steps that are being taken in that light. So Comrade Beatie, you'll go for about 15 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Joel to share what's coming out from the research.
Thank you very much, Phindile. Let me first just apologize for the minister. He has been felled by the flu, so I'm a very old and cheap substitute. I'm the representative of the ANC at the National IEC Multi-Party Committee, and I've also been involved in candidate selection and leadership selection since the 90s. I'm going to share some slides just to make it easier. Oh. Are you able to see anything yet? Just double check. Okay, here we go. Are you able to see it now?
Yes.
Right. I'm going to start off with the whole idea of renewal in terms of all these issues that you are looking at today, and say that this idea of strengthening internal democracy is not something that came with renewal. It has really been with us since the unbanning of the ANC, when we moved from being a liberation movement, mostly underground, to being a democratic movement competing for votes in a constitutional democracy. improving it as we go along is one of the most vital pillars of our renewal. It's in our internal democracy, in the way that we have selected candidates, in the way that we have selected leadership, the whole idea of factionalism, permanent factions and so on, that has undermined the strength of the democracy that we have been having. What you have to realize is that in the ANC since 1990, nominations for leaders and for candidates, as well as ideas for new policy, starts at a branch level. So we have over the years between 500,000 and 1.5 million members. Any branch that curates, that has more than half their members present, can nominate leaders, can nominate candidates, and can put forward policy resolutions. Whatever happens at the local level, when you've got 4,500 branches, is complicated. So it gets consolidated at a provincial level into a provincial nomination or a provincial position for the policy conferences. And then when you go to conference where you may be voting or electing for leaders or for new policies, you then have 90% of the voting members being branch representatives. So at a conference of 5,000 people, about 4,500 will be from branches. They do not have to take on a provincial consolidated position. They can still vote for whoever they want, and they can still support the policy that their branch mandated them to do. Now, when it comes to candidate selection, it's a slightly different issue because we don't select our candidates at conferences. Again, candidates for government are nominated by a branch, consolidated at provincial level or at local level at what we call sub-regional or municipal level for local government. And we then have a threshold for who will make it onto a ballot paper for us to make a decision. And that threshold, let's say we're electing members of parliament, the threshold will be the full 400 seats. Okay, so we will get 400 names, and of course, only the top 200 probably will get in, maybe a little bit more, but the rest will be there if we need balance. It will be there to replace people who may pass away or resign, so that the full 400 seats will be filled. So the leadership elections and the candidate elections are about as democratic as it can be. Even for public representatives, the democratic vote or nomination that comes from the branches is like a party primary in a way. So you count the number of nominations someone received, the number of votes they received at branch level, and you then take at least the top 10 to 20% and you make that untouchable. Okay, so the reason for that is you may have your top 200 members of parliament candidates without a single person among them who could fill the portfolio of Minister of Finance if you get elected as government. So the party has to do some shuffling to make sure that the top 200, or what we call the electable positions, are as representative of the people that vote for us, the sectors in our society, the different classes, different races, and 50% has to be women. So there is some reshuffling that is done at a higher level, but it is not done by party leaders, because the party leaders are the ones who are being elected here. So the party leaders don't take part in that, they only approve the final lists. And we have sort of independent structures that do that. I can answer more questions about that if there's a lot of them. Now, over the years, we have had to introduce stricter rules and controls, because every time you have a system that's democratic, there are some people who will abuse that democracy, who maybe will try and buy votes or buy influence. There are even some people who auction votes or branches to vote for people who are looking for votes. So the more democratic your process is, the easier it is for corrupt people to try and capture it or to try and undermine it. In 2015, at our National General Council, for the first time, the issue of buying votes and capturing votes became seen as a real threat to our internal democracy. And we then started making stricter and stricter rules, while at the same time opening it up more and more to a democratic process. Because if people are trying to capture you, if people are trying to subvert your your process, the best way to fight back and to overcome it is to make it as transparent and as democratic as possible, so that all your members feel that they have a strong stake in the process and that it's as fair as possible. So over the years, we've made a lot of quite big improvements. The setting up of the electoral committee last year was one of the improvements that came out of our previous conference. It now operates under President Motlanthe, and it is the ANC's own IEC. It makes the rules, it rules on disputes, and it oversees the process for candidates as well as for leadership. It does not run the elections. The elections are run by independent agencies or structures of the ANC that are independent of leadership. So all our processes always have to be approved by the NEC. But basically they have been really committed to safeguarding democracy rather than factions in this process. So let's start with the party and the candidate selection. First thing we've got to realize is that political parties are the only suitable vehicles we have for representation in a democracy, especially when you have such a divided and diverse society as we have in South Africa. Any party that wants to get more than 10% of the vote has to start appealing to more than one group of voters, or one category of voters, or one interest group, or rural or urban, or whatever. And to do that, you need a very broad basket of policies and options that you can give to voters. It's very difficult for the small parties that get under 10% or the independents to forge any kind of social cohesion. And there's some ancient people who said that political parties are an alternative to war. And in some way that is it. Political parties have to represent the interests of society, the conflicts in society, and deal with them. The bigger your party is, the more those conflicts are internalized in your party itself and has to be fought out there. When a party wants to elect public representatives, you have to put people up there who can understand and campaign for your policies, and if elected to government, who can implement them. We firmly believe that the PR system that we've got now serves our divided and diverse society very well. It's almost impossible to gain mass support and forge internal cohesion if you don't have a PR system. So at local government level, you'll know we have a mixed system, half PR and half constituency based. And that's where we often have more problems as well. So ANC policies go the same route, they go to branch level. We try and get all discussion documents out 6 months before policy conference and 8 or 9 months before national conference, so that branches can really unpack them, get their own expert advice, do their own research, and make their own inputs in it. So what has come out of the policy conference now are draft policies for discussion towards December. Now, we all know that the ANC has been in a slow and steady decline for the last 18 years in terms of voter support. It has actually been slower than many of us think. We've been going down by between 3 and 5% every election. And in 2019, there was a slight uptick of going up again before we went down more in 2021. After, what is it now? 26 years, 28 years, I can never remember, of democracy, it's not a bad track record for a liberation movement. Some of the factors that led to our decline are obviously self-induced. And they're the issues that policy conference and the renewal document looked at very, very seriously. What happened to our credibility? Why is there less trust in the ANC? What about our performance in government? What is wrong with our implementation? What policies need to be addressed? So looking at our own flaws has been our major preoccupation. We also have to understand, though, that we are living in one of the most difficult times ever, with very many negative global and local factors in terms of economics, in terms of the pandemic, in terms of the food security issues, in terms of everyone's fear about climate change and so on. There are many things where the power to deal with them are elsewhere and not in the hands of our own political system. what is quite interesting is that while the ANC has lost, from a high of 68%, we're now sitting on 47%. While we have lost those many votes, neither of the two main opposition parties have managed to capitalize on it. So the EFF remains around 10% to 12% max, and the DA around 20 to 23%. So the loss of confidence in the ANC may not be a loss of confidence only in the ANC, but a loss of confidence in politics or in our democratic system in the country. And there can be many reasons for that distrust of politicians. We think that some of the reasons, other than the incredibly challenging times we live in, are also related to the quality of input that voters get about the choices that they face. When we started elections, most voters got their information from community meetings, from people they trusted, and from radio, with newspapers and TV coming second and third. More than 60% of voters now get their information from Facebook and other forms of social media. And because of the algorithm and so on, people tend to be fed the things that feed their own fears and fantasies, rather than the kind of broader picture that you may have received when you opened a newspaper and were confronted with news that you had not sought out. So to some extent, what is happening in our politics is a simplification of what the real issues and challenges are, and much more populism and sensationalism in terms of the kind of responses. The kind of issues that can dominate for a few days and swing an election really have become something that we have to look at very seriously now. So in terms of other parties and how they select public representatives, there's a huge variety of ways of doing it. Some of the smaller, more regional parties also have a community-based process of doing it. Others advertise in the newspapers, others appoint through fiat of the leader or the commander of the party. So in most of them, the party is the supreme authority. Now, when we look at the selection of public representatives, we've always started at the branch. We have now strengthened the intra-party democracy to also involve democracy from our voters, especially in the constituency part of our system, which is at ward level in local government. So nominations now happen by the party branch. We nominate 4 candidates for every ward. Those 4 candidates are then taken to a community meeting. The community can vote in more candidates if they wish to. So if half the people in that hall feel that the ANC is not providing any sufficient candidates that they can trust, the community can propose new candidates. This is in an ANC ward, not in an opposition ward necessarily. And then the community then can vote on what would now be the 5 candidates that are available for selection. And in this process, in the last local elections, even though we were very, very badly affected by 3 months of COVID restrictions on meetings, for 2 months before candidate registration, no public meetings were permitted indoors. And for 1 month, we were limited to 50 people per meeting. So for example, if we wanted to have a meeting in one voting district in one ward, we had to have a school or a multi-venue hall where you could have 50 people in 6 different places, and the candidates would go from one meeting to another. And at the end of that, you would have a public vote to see what the people preferred as their candidate. So this community vote involved about 1.5 million people. That's beyond the 500,000 people from the ANC who participated at their branch meetings. Now, one of the unexpected consequences we got from this is that too much democracy may have become a risk. I see it's one of the issues that you look at as well, but there were definitely unintended consequences. One of them is that the most popular person in a community would get elected, even though he perhaps had a criminal record, which as an ANC candidate would preclude him from standing, okay? Or a populist would get elected who is not very committed to ANC policy, and maybe sounds more like she should be voting for another party than ours. So those consequences we have to deal with. We have to fine-tune this process and make sure that we get the best possible and the most representative candidates. Where it becomes really dangerous, though, is when you have a lot of people that you can say are not very disciplined members of a party. A lot of them can vote against your party, can start voting with independents. They could support somebody else for mayor. They could bust the party line, sometimes for the right reasons, sometimes for the wrong reasons. And it's very important that you also become aware that criminal interests try and capture local government, sometimes through capturing the candidate selection process. They sometimes have people standing as independents, or they even try and take over party nomination processes, especially in areas where they know the party is a shoe-in for victory. So all of this has to be very carefully managed, and we have not perfected it yet, but it's very, very important to still have strong party structures and not just have a populist process, because a populist process will not necessarily result in stable government or in selecting people who can actually govern properly. It may just select the people who can make the loudest noise or is the most popular at that point. I want to make an analogy between churches and political parties. We will all know that there are churches in our country that make money, fleece their congregations, and sometimes have a very dubious kind of gospel that they preach. These churches are often one-man shows with one big celebrity that can fill a stadium, that gets all the money from that church, that makes all the rules for that church, and that is accountable actually to no one. Even though they may have 1 million members, they account to no one because the church has no board. It has no rules, it has no constitution, and it has no one to oversee the pastor. Now, the same thing can happen in politics if you don't have party structures that at least say, no, here the ANC has got 6,000 people who are going to be elected to local government. Somehow, we have to keep them within the policies, within the rules, within the accepted behavior of ANC public representatives. So while we must make the process as democratic as possible, we must ensure that parties don't abdicate their responsibility to still produce a responsive and responsible government. One of the other unintended consequences of the more democratic process is that we started struggling to meet our gender quota. So it's very easy to meet your gender quota on the PR list because there you simply make every second person a woman. In a ward where you can only vote for one candidate, it's almost impossible to enforce a quota. And what happened for the first time when we used to just have branches nominating, we got about 55 to 60% men, but we still got a decent amount of women ward candidates. Once we opened it to the community vote, we got 70% male candidates. Now the ANC doesn't get a lot of PR candidates because we win most of the wards. That means it becomes almost impossible for us to balance gender in local government. And that's not something that we intended to achieve. It's something that really shocked us, because obviously it means that our voters are not quite as transformed as our members are yet in terms of believing that women have the capacity to lead government. The same thing applies to people who have integrity issues or capacity issues, that the party still has to find a way to ensure that we have both the integrity and the capacity to run government. As a party, we're committed to constantly try and improve this, but we also have to have evidence-based policies in this regard and make sure that where unintended consequences take place, our policy conference, our conference at the end of the year, and our electoral committee will have to try and address these weaknesses and ensure that we meet our other policy imperatives like the 50% woman one. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for that, Beatie. I'm going to come back after Joel has sort of outlined what the research is, what sort of questions are coming up in this research process. But thank you for that input. Joel, please go ahead.
Thanks, Beatie. So the report we've just released today focuses predominantly on the theory of intra-party democracy, which I'll refer to as IPD going forward, and how it relates to democracy and accountability more generally in our politics and in our country. So from the outset, IPD is a contentious issue, and even its definition is disputed, and there's no single overarching definition. At the heart of it, though, is the extent to which political parties incorporate and then practice democracy in their internal operations. And even this is subjective, because what I may consider a model of democracy, another person may view as being far from that. But it is essentially quite a broad term describing various ways for parties to include members in deliberation and decision-making. The literature, as Beatie has alluded to, places the greatest weight on the power of members to determine a role in selecting candidates and leaders and in policy development. Some scholars identify IPD, and I quite subscribe to this approach, as an effort to limit the power of party elites and to provide a framework to allow members, regardless of their position within a party, to be treated fairly, to be consulted, and to determine the way that the party manages itself. IPD is also essentially about the power relations between members and leadership. And when implemented effectively, it provides members tools through institutional structures to have a say in how their party operates. So while there's general agreement about the basic tenets of IPD, and these are transparency, accountability, fair disciplinary procedures, involvement in leadership and candidate selection and policy development, as well as representation, there remains a variety of views across the political spectrum about the actual impact of IPD and whether it is even something we should be advocating for. So scholars continue to debate, whether greater democracy in a party does lead to more democracy in the political system, and if there are unintended consequences that can actually strengthen elites under the guise of reform. So I think a way that we need to approach these questions is to look at the specifics of our country, its history, its political dynamics, and its needs. And based on the research, we argue, my vote counts, our position is that South Africa does indeed require more democracy in its parties, not just for the sake of it, but because the impact will have quite tangible outcomes for our democracy and for the quality of all of our lives. So a big part of the research was looking at what the role of political parties is supposed to be in our constitutional democracy. And at the heart of it, they're meant to serve as representatives of the people, to provide different policy options, to serve as what we call interest aggregators. And today we can't really imagine our modern constitutional democracy without parties. And while there are other ways for people to participate politically, parties continue to be the main vehicles through which this takes place. And one of their most important functions is to connect citizens with government. Given the population size, it's long been impossible for every single person, or for the population en masse to interact with government, and parties are supposed to serve this purpose. And parties that are internally democratic, that empower their members on the ground who are connected to and their constituents, that provides them with opportunities to channel these demands into policy decisions. Very often, as I'm sure we all are aware, it seems that parties are not always acting in the best interest of the public, but are more concerned with their own management, with their survival, with their success in elections. And people see parties as vehicles for personal enrichment or to further their careers. And I think this conception of what parties are and the role that they serve in our society is something which we continue to need to interrogate. So part of the issue is that in law, parties are considered private voluntary associations or corporations. What this essentially means is that they are largely left to their own devices in terms of their inner workings. There are some references to parties in our constitution. There's some guidance from case law. Parties can't unfairly discriminate against members, but the extent to which they internalize democracy is largely left to their own devices. And there is, in South Africa, unlike many other countries, there's no law governing the inner life of parties. This gives elites enormous power to decide if their party is going to be open and inclusive, or on the other end of the spectrum, spaces where decisions are made in a top-down manner and where members have little voice in determining what their party does. So our contention is that parties should be spaces where talent and good policy proposals for the betterment of society should facilitate one's rise to power, rather than connections, resources, and loyalty. Now, as mentioned before, the whole concept of IPD continues to be very contentious, and there are critics, and Beatie also alluded to this, who view it as being incompatible with developing a strong party that can compete in the electoral and political space and ensure its mandates are filled. Others say that IPD is not even possible to achieve because, by their very nature, parties gravitate towards undemocratic structures to reach their ends. I don't agree with that, but within the theory and literature, there are many proponents of IPD who view it as being an essential ingredient needed to facilitate democratic culture more generally in the country. And just to make this clear, we are not saying that there's no democracy in our political parties or the ANC. That is not our position at all. All parties to varying degrees do follow certain levels of IPD. What we are saying, though, is that where there's insufficient commitment to instituting democratic culture, values, and practice in a party, the repercussions, both for membership, but possibly more importantly for the public more generally, are quite profound. And when there is a lack of internal democracy in a governing party, the impact is felt even more because of the influence the governing party has on society. So for years, there have been analysis around, issues of a lack of democracy in the ANC. So during the Mbeki HIV/AIDS denialism, issues around the arms deal, the support of former President Zuma in Parliament, these are indicative of problems when a party has concentrated power at the top, and when ordinary members, even MPs, fear that speaking out or following their conscience will lead to their political demise. This continues today in certain ways. We know, for example, in the DA, speaking out against the party policy can have quite severe repercussions for their members. And more generally, due to the nature of our closed-list party system, in which parties and elites have great power in determining who represents them in Parliament, with the ability to recall, members are beholden to party bosses and not to the public. And as a result, they generally abide by high levels of party discipline. And our understanding is that this weakens Parliament's efforts to hold the executive to account. So we can't and we shouldn't dictate what policies a party should choose and what they should represent. But one of the political scientists I've been reading for the paper, his name is TRL, he says that how can we trust party representatives to consider the arguments put forward by opposing groups in the public sphere if they ignore the reasoning of their own members? So, we're saying that the existence of IPD within parties can also encourage the development of a wider democratic culture. This is especially important for countries in transition who are consolidating their democracies like South Africa. And for those in parties who then serve in government, parties are essentially where they receive their political training. And if parties are not democratic spaces, then it follows that they will be less likely to embrace these practices when they serve or in government or serving as the opposition. So parties, by their very nature, circulate towards certain levels of autocracy, but there are measures that can be instituted, carefully constructed, to minimize this and to strengthen democracy in parties. Something worth focusing on is that more democracy in a party can actually benefit the party itself. So some advocates for IPD argue that the greater amount of democracy within a party leads to the selection of more capable leaders, better policies, and therefore electoral success. And democratizing can assist a party to retain power and relevance and rebuild faith from the electorate. So in the most recent Afrobarometer study, trust in political parties, both in the governing party and opposition parties, was less than 30%. And generally, there's a lack of trust between the public and parties. And the way, according to the literature, that parties can rebuild this is through greater democracy. And just a quote here from Susan Scarrow, who's one of the foremost experts on this subject. She writes that in countries where there is a widespread popular disillusionment with politicians and parties, and where there is growing interest in democratic self-determination, responsive parties may rightly decide that they would be well advised to adopt more transparent and inclusive internal procedures. In such cases, the changes the parties make to benefit themselves may have beneficial outcomes for the wider society and for the stability and legitimacy of democratic institutions. And I think this speaks very closely to our current context. I'm almost done. So just given what we're speaking about today in the discussion, given that we have a representative of the ANC, given that it's just been the ANC's policy conference, I just wanted to touch very briefly on some issues that are coming up related to that. So we have seen a very clear trend and a developing narrative from the governing party around renewal, reform, rebirth, efforts to rebuild the image and integrity of the party. And it's quite commendable. It's quite a very frank way that they are dealing with these issues. Looking at the discussion documents that were circulated before the ANC's conference and the opening address, some of the media reports that are coming out, it is clear that the ANC is concerned with internal democracy, although it might not use this exact term. And our reading is that it sees it as crucial to rebuilding itself. And its decision to keep the step-aside rule as one of the tangibles that we can speak about further, I think must really be commended and seen as an essential to its democracy project. The proposal to revet membership must also be seen in the same vein. So its reason for doing all of this may be politically expedient for its own survival, but regardless, the time is opportune to take this seriously and to see how parties across the spectrum can democratize, because the outcome will not only benefit them, but more importantly, we believe it will benefit our democracy. And in the long run, tangibles like service delivery, governance, corruption. Lastly, just to end, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to this. There's no blueprint that you can impose on a party around how it needs to implement democracy. Parties need to consider what will work best for them, and we as the public also need to have a say. And this is with respect to all parties, not only the ANC. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much for that, Joel. I'm going to open up now for Q&A, and I'm closely watching what's in the chat. But as we wait for comments or questions, one thing that emerges as a commonality between the two presentations is this recognition that there is a growing distrust in political parties or in politics with the BP or with informal politics, in a sense. And Beatie has sort of outlined what some of the reasons are. I mean, I've got a big question about whether it's really about information and how information filters, or whether it's about how politics has become increasingly associated with the big man, with masculinism, with maneuver, with questions that basically marginalize everyday concerns, but also with upward mobility. For a few, politics has become increasingly associated with careerism and everything that that's basically comes with that. So maybe you would care to sort of comment on that this distrust in politics, in politics and political parties is indicative of that, but also that politics is not just parties, that people are political and engaging politically in different ways. The second thing, perhaps a question, there is a question in the chat box, so maybe let's take that from Amanda. Amanda says, when you look at the lack of gender parity in the ANC when members choose candidates, do you think this is a sign that the members have not internalized the values of the ANC? I think that's directed at Comrade Beatie, so maybe you can take that, Comrade.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the questions and for the comments, and Joel's very interesting paper as well. I think half the reason that people are disillusioned with politics is because of politicians. It's because politicians that play to the new forms of media and the new kind of populist, sensationalist way of doing politics will always make news. I mean, even as the most dedicated member of the ANC, I will always read a story about some sensationalist opposition politician before I read a boring story about ordinary governance by one of my own leaders. And I think that it's symptomatic of what is happening in society around politics. And as I say, we deserve it. To a large extent, we are responsible for it, but there are also other players that are important, like the media, like civil society and so on, where we need to do more education and more engagement and more civic education about why it is important to safeguard these institutions and to build them. In terms of the issue of internal democracy, you must remember that if you want to govern, as the ANC does, in about 170 different governments at local, national, and provincial level, you have to have policy coherence, and you have to have coherence in terms of your planning and your programming and your implementation. And it's at that point where you have this concept of democratic centralism. Have as much participation in making policies as possible, as much participation in leadership selection as possible. But once you have made a decision, you have to have a party line. Otherwise, you are conning your voters and saying, this is our manifesto, but if Beatie's the premier of KZN, she will do something different from Phindile, who's the premier of Gauteng. So democratic centralism is here to stay. In terms of gender parity, I must just say, I think in the ANC, it has been internalized. When we had a purely ANC selection process, we always met our targets. Since we have had the community participation in the ward candidate selection, it's become much more difficult to do it. And we will have to adapt to that and find a way, because it's in our constitution, it's an absolute must have. The only question that came out of policy conference on the gender issue was whether we must make it constitutional that also the officials have to be gender balanced, not just the NEC or the PEC or the REC. That's something for branches to discuss, but our commitment to that one cannot be moved, and it won't be moved because more than half the ANC members are women. Thanks.
You're on mute, Phindile.
Perhaps let me just pose a question to you, Joel, before going to going back to the chat. And this question is basically about the research that you're citing, and this relevance and resonance of this idea, intra-party democracy. In the research that you're doing, is there any attempt at all to lean into some of the theories and experiences that speak more directly to the South African situation or South African experience? And what comes to mind for me is how historically, for instance, workers in the 70s and the 80s, speaking the same language about internal democracy, and how in as much as they were fighting for democracy in a future South Africa, but democracy inside the organization was also important. And there's quite a lot of theorization that emerged out of there about the meaning of internal democracy. So that's just basically a question about this research and the extent to which it leans on some of this theory that's been built from the South African experience of worker struggle. I'm going to go back to the chat to just check. There's another question here. Is the ANC ready and ripe for one member, one vote? And is this prevalent amongst other political parties? So that's a question for you, Beatie. I'm not sure if you sort of get what the question is going at, but perhaps as you maybe prepare to respond to that, I mean, I would like to ask a question about, like I said at the beginning, theoretically, when you look at the ANC, there is the saying about the power lies with the branches, first and foremost. So theoretically, when you look at the ANC, actually, you say, wow, this is actually quite a democratic organization with branches, with regions, with midterm gatherings that allow the ANC to take stock, with policy conferences, in the selection of candidates, but also in the selection of delegates to different decision-making bodies. But as we've seen in the past, money plays a big role. So there's a question of democracy, but there's also the commodification of democracy. And some people have also said, actually, the ANC's rule for the past 27 years, which has failed to resolve the unemployment question and many of the socio-economic issues, has actually rendered many working class people inside the party to be doing the bidding of rich people inside the party who buy their way into election. And I'm not just talking about the top, I'm talking about what happens at branch level, what happens going into regional conferences and so on. So I mean, I'd like your comments on that, this idea of intra-party democracy and the commodification of democracy in the ANC. The second, I mean, I like that you're reflecting on this recent experiment with what comes up again from Joe's paper around the selectorate, so broadening the participation in terms of who decides on candidates, broadening that to include communities. Aside from this question of gender and inclusion, what other lessons are you picking up? I mean, I can get a sense that you're also saying people with criminal records can also push their way, or people who have conducted themselves unethically, maybe have committed gender-based violence or have stolen public resources, can be so popular in the community that they actually make it through this opening of the door for broadened participation in the selection of candidates. Your response to that?
Okay, let me first start with the issue of one member, one vote. We've always had one member, one vote, because anybody who comes to a branch meeting, which you can only do if you're a member, can vote for candidates and leaders. And the nomination process is like primaries in certain other countries, where all party members can come and vote for their choice. We are not at the point where parties like the Conservative Party in Great Britain or the Labour Party in Israel have public votes of all registered members for their leaders. So that's the next step that the Conservatives will take now in Britain between the two top leaders that have been identified. Now, what happens there is you have a completely weird situation where most of the Conservative Party members in the UK are over 65 years old and live in the south of England. The party is trying to represent the whole country. That's how someone like Boris Johnson got elected as the leader of the party, because only those old white, basically, people voted in that election. What we're trying to do in the ANC is to not just be restricted by what our voters, our members say, because our members are not fully representative of society, but to also take it to the voters in ANC wards to tell us which person is their preferred candidate. And this is especially important where, you know, you can win the election at an ANC branch if you have money, as you say, or if you can provide a bribe for everybody or whatever, if you're nice. But that doesn't make you an ideal candidate for the people who are not ANC members, but still would like to be ANC voters. Unfortunately, as democracy is part of our culture, I agree with what you said about Kusatu, for example. It's also the culture of the UDF and the anti-apartheid movement was incredibly democratic, even though we had no state democracy. I think we are very committed to democracy, but like many other things, money can corrupt democracy. And you're absolutely right about the more money you have, the more power you have. It's not as simple as one person can buy the whole country, but it is sometimes as simple as one person or one criminal enterprise can buy contracts in the municipality by manipulating who becomes the decision makers in that municipality. And that is something that the ANC cannot clean up on its own. It's something all South Africans have to commit to, and all our institutions have to be strengthened to do. Because for me personally, and I think for the ANC in the policy conference, the hollowing out of the state through state capture and the hollowing out of its capacity is one of the biggest dangers that we face. In terms of what lessons the voters teach us, sometimes they're good lessons and sometimes they're not. For example, in by-elections, you can learn very quickly that if you ignore the people's choice, you will get an independent standing against the ANC and taking that ward from the ANC. So we have a lot of debates about integrity issues when it comes to, do we accept people or don't we? If they're the people's choice, does that trump being an ANC member or being committed to ANC policy? And in the end, we have to clean up our act, and we cannot just be completely opportunistic about what candidates we accept and don't accept. You end up in the kind of trouble that many of the coalition governments have ended up in this country, where it becomes impossible to govern. Thanks.
All right. Joel, do you want to come in at this point?
Thanks, Wendy. Just to pick up on the the monetization of politics. I mean, obviously, my Vote Counts has been working for years on around the Political Party Funding Act and ensuring there's transparency and disclosures of private donations that parties receive. Something which we also feel strongly around is the need for there to be transparency for internal party elections. And my understanding is that there's a court case that Amabungani is involved in that we're still awaiting the outcome. But we hope that this is, another part of inner working life of political parties that will also finally be regulated. And we think it will, definitely assist in minimizing the extent to which sort of money can buy your way into these spaces. And I just wanted to comment quickly on, the lack of faith and trust in parties. I mean, our understanding is that it's mainly around a lack of accountability. So when parties don't sanction their own members for doing something wrong, people lose faith. When people, when parties close ranks and protect themselves because it will hurt their integrity, people can see through this and they lose trust. So for us, I mean, I think that's very central to the demise or to the lack of faith that people have in parties. And then Penny, I know you asked me around, if the paper looks at sort of democratic traditions in trade unions, during apartheid. The next paper we're going to be releasing that focuses specifically on, it looks at each. We're going to look at the main political parties and how democratic they are in the internal operations. So that will come into that will be in that paper to some extent.
Okay, all right. We've got a lot of questions now in the chat, so I'm glad that we're warming up. We've got one question from Michael. I'm not sure if you can all see that, just to save time, but it's a question about independent candidates in 2024 and how you don't sound too excited about that. Beatie citing issues of populism, accountability that creep in, but 19 million voters disengaged from our political system, opting out and choosing not to vote. So if you, Beatie, now could just articulate your thoughts on the question of disengaged voters, please. That's the one question from Michael. And then there's another question. I'm going to read all of them because we are also running out of time. To what extent do international power relations impact on the lack of democracy in political organizations or in the ANC in particular? Is it okay to say people focus on sensational news, especially with citizen journalism increasing, as opposed to saying people are focusing on actions that maybe leaders or so-called leaders feel are not real politics? Could it be that people know what they want and feel and can never be represented in a representative democracy? That's Dineo Sitole posing that question. The third question, do mechanical solutions solve political problems, i.e. the step-aside rule? Which party in South Africa is the best model for nominating leaders? Or do they all work on the same system? Can't we introduce empirical measures for candidates such as qualification, experience, votes, etc.? And why isn't there voter education in high school for just understanding spheres of government? That's anonymous. And lastly, another anonymous for Beatie. That question is for Beatie. While you have mentioned the hollowing out of democracy because of state capture, it is the ANC itself who was fingered as being one of the main culprits of state capture by deeply corruptible politicians the party has, and the finding by the Zondo Commission that the party directly benefited from illicit dealings. How does the party, especially with claims of renewal and in light of IPD, aim to address this? So we're going to respond to all those questions. Most of those questions were for Beatie, but if you could just respond to all those questions as you also wrap up, and then Joel, and then I'm going to give you a chance to make closing remarks so that we finish in 5 minutes because we started 5 minutes late.
Okay, let me try and wrap up a few. I definitely can't deal with all of them. Most of them are not answerable yet, and we are still in a learning process to try and get on top of some of these very complex issues. Firstly, money buying power has been a practice in the last few years. Comrade Khalima's commission has now made clear rules for leadership contestation that you may not use money in a myriad of ways. You may only use it for travel and venues and so on. Every campaign has to fully disclose every cent that they collect and spend to the ANC, not to the voters. But at least that's the beginning of proper accountability, and also taking steps against people who break the rules. I agree that that the absence of sanction has been a major issue. And I think partly because the Zondo Commission took so many years, it has come, it just seems that every year more and more has been exposed, and we have not yet had the strength of institutions and conviction and maybe even political will to deal with it. I think we now have the conviction and the political will. The response of the ANC at the policy conference was to implement everything that came out of the Zondo Commission, to basically confess and say where we have gone wrong and where we need to strengthen our systems, but also to say that some of the issues are political issues and not corruption issues. So for example, the issue of independence, the issue of directly electing your president, those are political opinions expressed by Judge Zondo, not solutions necessarily. We need to first do a lot more research before we toss our whole political system out because of that. In terms of voter education, it is being done by the IEC. I absolutely agree that very few others are engaged in this at all. But the IEC does try. They have also suffered from limited budgets and big cuts in expenses. In terms of the independence at national level that are coming now for national and provincial level, I think it's unfortunate. I don't have a problem with independence at local level, where you have a small constituency where you as an individual can directly service your constituency. To be an independent at national level, you would have to get about 50,000 votes. You'll be able to stand in a province, so you could get 50,000 votes across the province. You will never meet your constituents or the people that voted for you. You have no way of identifying them or having structures or being close to them. And as soon as you form structures and become a party, you are no longer an independent. So independence, my prediction is that independence will be the rejects from political leadership competitions in all the parties. So anyone who does not make it back onto the list of their party, of all parties, are going to stand as independents because they have some voter recognition. Some of them are celebrities in their own right. And we are going to end up with independents like that. When the ANC heads under 50%, or if it heads under 50%, 5 of these independents could hold the balance of power in our nation without having to produce any accountability in terms of their policies, without having any chance of implementing their policies, without having any real influence on government. But if 5 of them hold the balance of power, what does that mean? Those 5 people will represent 250,000 votes. What does it mean for parties that represent 10 million votes and cannot implement because a few independents hold the balance of power? For me, it's a dangerous new road we're going down. And it's not one that has been tried effectively in any but 6 countries where there are high rates of literacy and political, whatever, maturity, and people have a single transferable vote system where they can vote both for a party and for individuals. Even there, they don't vote for independents, they vote for individuals within a party. So for me, we're in a very confused system. Yeah, we'll see how it works, but the reality is that if we have 300 independents and 50 parties, as we had 48 last time, we are going to have a ballot paper that is about 40 pages long. Think about counting those votes and checking that there are not 2 votes in each ballot paper. Think about the boxes you need, the printing you need, the voter education you need, and it's a nightmare. So as I've raised these issues at the IEC quite strongly for the ANC, and many other parties agree that it is, it's going to create more problems than real accountability. Thanks.
All right, so not very enthusiastic about that. Joel, concluding remarks.
Thanks, Phindile. So, no, we view IPD as an essential intervention to deepen democracy and accountability. And exactly what this will look like is still to be determined. It could be different for every party. And we don't necessarily feel that legal regulation is the way to go. parties need to embrace this themselves to see the benefit for their own operations, but also for the country more generally. And we feel that if it is imposed, it is less likely to shift culture and to take hold. So part of what my council will be doing over the next few months is continued research on qualitative research on how internally democratic parties are. We will release this to provide the voter, to provide the public with more information. We think it's really important that people can practice their political rights from the most informed position possible. And we do maintain that a party's commitment to internal democracy is indicative of how that party will operate in government, serving in the opposition. It isn't a panacea to all our political problems, but we continue to see IPD as an essential piece of the puzzle, excuse me. And it is a long-term project that will continuously evolve, but its difficulties and the road that we will need to travel to get there is not something that should deter us. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that, Joel. This brings us to the end of this particular webinar. I know that there are other webinars lined up on this topic, so do stay tuned and follow My Vote Counts on social media for updates on that. Once again, an apology for two things, not having my video on at the beginning and therefore delaying us. I struggled with technicalities, but also to apologize on the point of inclusivity and the sign language interpreter. I mean, there has been a message typed in the chat that this is something that we'll definitely get right for the next webinar. I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this webinar and granting me the opportunity to facilitate. If there aren't other announcements, I'm just checking the chat box. It looks like there aren't any announcements. I'm not sure if we can conclude on this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairperson, Facilitator.
Thank you very much.